Samantha had always been the kind of person who threw herself into her work. As an attorney at a high-powered law firm, she thrived on the stress, the long hours, and the rush of closing deals. Tonight was no different. She was alone in the office, reviewing a case file for a high-profile client. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead filled the empty building, casting an eerie glow over her desk. It was well past midnight when she finally looked at the clock. 1:47 a.m. She rubbed her eyes and stood to stretch, glancing out the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city below. The streets were nearly empty, just the occasional car drifting by. The office building itself felt strangely still, more so than usual. A quiet that felt oppressive. Samantha returned to her desk, determined to finish the last few hours of work so she could go home and get some sleep. But as she settled back into her chair, the lights flickered. Just for a second. Then they went out completely, plunging her office into darkness. "Great," she muttered, fumbling for her phone to use as a flashlight. Suddenly, the lights snapped back on. Samantha blinked in confusion. The clock on her desk now read 1:47 a.m., the exact time it had shown when she last looked. But that couldn't be right. She had been working for at least another 20 minutes since then. She shook it off as a glitch in the power surge and refocused on her work. Minutes passed. The same hum of the lights. The same empty street outside. Her focus was interrupted again when she glanced at the clock. 1:47 a.m. Her heart skipped a beat. The second hand on the clock wasn't moving. Maybe it was broken. She tapped the glass face of the clock, but nothing happened. Checking her phone, her stomach dropped. 1:47 a.m. She leaned back in her chair, her brain struggling to comprehend what was happening. It felt like time had frozen. Or worse, she was somehow stuck in it. The air in the office felt colder now, almost oppressive. She pushed herself away from her desk and walked toward the elevator, eager to leave. She pressed the button repeatedly, but the doors remained shut. The numbers above the door didn't change either, frozen at 7. That was her floor. It felt as though the entire building had ground to a halt. The silence in the building pressed against her ears, too thick, too wrong. She decided to take the stairs instead, hurrying down the corridor toward the emergency exit. But when she pushed the door open, she froze. The stairwell was a dark void. Not just dimly lit, but completely black, as if the stairs descended into nothingness. She couldn't even see the first step. A chill ran down her spine, and she slowly backed away from the doorway. "Okay, Sam, calm down," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. "It's just a power outage. You'll figure this out." She returned to the main office floor, but everything looked subtly wrong. The desks, which were empty moments ago, now had papers strewn across them, coffee cups half full, pens rolling slowly on their surfaces as though someone had just been there. She could have sworn it was empty when she last walked through. And then there were the shadows. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something, a figure standing near the far end of the room, in the shadows by the copier. It was motionless, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was there. Her breath caught in her throat. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. No answer. The figure didn't move. Samantha's heart was hammering in her chest now. She slowly backed toward her desk, never taking her eyes off the shadowy figure. It remained completely still, almost blending into the dark corner of the office, like it belonged there. She reached for her phone again, ready to dial for help, but her phone screen was still frozen at 1:47 a.m. No signal. No time. Nothing. She looked up and saw the figure was closer now. No movement, no sound, but it had somehow closed half the distance between them in an instant. The shadowed outline was clearer now. Tall, with long, unnaturally thin limbs. Its head was cocked to one side, almost as if it was studying her. Samantha's legs trembled, her body frozen in fear. She backed away further, her breath shallow and rapid. A whisper, so faint she could barely hear it, cut through the silence. It came from the figure, though its mouth didn't move. The sound was more like a hiss, soft and serpentine, but she couldn't make out the words. The figure took a step closer. Panic seized her. She turned and ran, darting down the hallway and back toward the stairwell. She didn't care if it was pitch black. Anything was better than being trapped in here with that thing. But when she pushed open the stairwell door, it didn't lead to the stairwell anymore. Instead, she found herself back in her office. The same desk. The same frozen clock. 1:47 a.m. Samantha screamed in frustration and fear. She turned around, desperate to escape, but the door behind her had vanished. There were no doors at all. Just walls. The hum of the lights grew louder, almost deafening now. Her office began to feel like a cage, shrinking, the air thick and suffocating. And then she saw it again, the figure, standing silently in the corner, closer than before. Its head tilted toward her. A realization crept over her, more chilling than anything else: she was never getting out. Time wasn't frozen. It was repeating. She was trapped in a loop, a never-ending shift with no escape, no break, and no time to save herself. The figure took another step forward, and everything went dark. Samantha never made it out of the office that night. To everyone else, she simply vanished, her desk untouched, her coffee cup half full, and the clock on her desk permanently stuck at 1:47 a.m. When Mark and Emily moved into their new apartment, it seemed like the perfect place to start their lives together. A small, cozy two-bedroom flat in an old building on the edge of the city, it had charm, history, and a quiet neighborhood feel. It didn't hurt that it was cheap, either. The landlord, Mr. Benton, an older man with a tired smile, had given them a great deal. There was just one caveat: the upstairs tenant, Mrs. Hendricks. "She's been here for as long as I can remember," Mr. Benton had said. "Older woman, keeps to herself, but you might hear some odd noises. Don't mind her. She's just set in her ways." Emily brushed it off. Every old building had its quirks. A few odd noises were no big deal compared to the affordable rent. Mark wasn't bothered either, so they signed the lease and settled in. The first week went by smoothly. The apartment was everything they hoped for, and life felt good. Then, one night, they heard it, the sound of something dragging across the floor upstairs. It started slowly, just after midnight. A soft, scraping noise that seemed to go from one end of the apartment above them to the other. Emily woke up first. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, nudging Mark. He listened for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, probably just Mrs. Hendricks moving furniture or something." At 2 a.m. Mark shrugged. "Old people do weird stuff. Maybe she's a night owl." Emily wasn't convinced, but she let it go. After all, it was an old building. The noises were bound to happen. But the dragging sound continued every night, always at the same time, just after midnight, lasting for hours. Some nights it sounded like furniture scraping across the floor, other nights like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth. Emily became more uneasy with each passing night. "It's like she's waiting for something," she said one evening, her voice tight with anxiety. Mark tried to comfort her, but he couldn't shake the eerie feeling either. The footsteps always seemed so close, almost like they were in their apartment, just above their heads. One night, Emily had had enough. She stormed upstairs, determined to confront Mrs. Hendricks and ask her to keep it down. Mark followed reluctantly, unsure of what they would find. When they reached Mrs. Hendricks' door, Emily hesitated before knocking. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on them. She knocked softly, then louder when no one answered. After a long pause, the door creaked open slightly. Mrs. Hendricks stood there, a frail, hunched figure with white hair and a vacant stare. Can I help you? Her voice was raspy, barely more than a whisper. We live downstairs, Emily began, trying to be polite. We've been hearing some noises late at night. Like furniture being moved around. We just wanted to check if everything's okay. Mrs. Hendricks stared at them for a moment, then smiled. It was a strange, thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Everything's fine, she said softly. Don't worry about the noises. It's just my husband. Mark and Emily exchanged confused glances. Your husband? Mark asked. But we were told you live alone. Mrs. Hendricks' smile faded. Her expression became serious, almost sad. He's still here, she said quietly, then slowly shut the door without another word. They stood in the hallway, stunned. Mark tried to laugh it off, but Emily's face was pale. Something about the way Mrs. Hendricks had said, "He's still here," sent a chill down her spine. They went back to their apartment, but the noises didn't stop. If anything, they became louder, more insistent. The dragging sound seemed heavier, as if whatever was being moved upstairs was enormous. Sometimes they heard muffled voices, indistinct but unmistakably present, like a low conversation taking place just beyond the walls. One night, the noise was so loud that Emily couldn't take it anymore. She shook Mark awake, panic in her eyes. We have to go upstairs, she whispered. Something's wrong. I can feel it. Mark, though exhausted, agreed. Together, they made their way up the stairs again. This time, there was no hesitation. Emily knocked on Mrs. Hendricks' door firmly, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Mark turned the knob. To his surprise, the door creaked open. Mrs. Hendricks? Emily called out, stepping inside. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from a single lamp in the corner of the living room. The air was thick with dust and an odd, musty smell. The furniture was old and covered with sheets, as if it hadn't been touched in years. But the most unsettling part was the silence. The heavy, oppressive silence that made their skin crawl. Maybe she's out. Mark suggested, though he didn't believe it. As they ventured further into the apartment, Emily spotted something that made her blood run cold. In the corner of the room, partially obscured by shadows, was an old wheelchair. It was covered in dust, but the floor beneath it was freshly scratched, as if it had been moved back and forth recently. Just like the sound they had heard. Mark noticed it too. This is weird, he muttered. Let's get out of here. But before they could leave, they heard it, a soft creaking, coming from the bedroom at the end of the hallway. Without thinking, Emily moved toward the sound. Mark tried to stop her, but she pushed open the bedroom door. What they saw made them freeze in terror. Lying in the bed, under a thin blanket, was a skeletal figure. Its skin was shriveled, stretched tight over bones. The face, gaunt and hollow, was unmistakably that of Mrs. Hendricks. Her lifeless eyes stared up at the ceiling, her mouth slightly open as if in mid-breath. Emily gasped and stumbled back into Mark, who was too shocked to move. She's been dead for a long time, Mark whispered, his voice trembling. Suddenly, the dragging sound started again, louder this time, as if whatever had been pacing above them was now coming down the hall. The wheelchair in the living room began to creak, slowly moving on its own, rolling toward them. They didn't wait to see what was coming. Grabbing each other's hands, they ran out of the apartment, down the stairs, and out into the night, their hearts pounding in their chests. The next morning, they went to the landlord to tell him what they had found. Mr. Benton looked at them with wide eyes. But that's impossible, he said. Mrs. Hendricks passed away 5 years ago. She had no family. I haven't rented out that apartment since. Mark and Emily never returned to their apartment. They moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. But they could still hear it in their dreams, the sound of the wheelchair, creaking and dragging across the floor, never stopping, never leaving. Maggie always thought moving to a small town would bring peace. Life in the city had been chaotic, endless noise, strangers everywhere, and no sense of community. So when she and her husband Tom found a house in the quiet little town of Fairfield, they jumped at the chance. It was a charming old place on the edge of town, with a big yard and plenty of room for their future plans. From the first day, the neighbors were welcoming. They brought pies, cookies, and small housewarming gifts, eager to share stories about Fairfield's history. It seemed like a dream come true. But then, things started to happen, small, strange things at first. It began with the creaks. Every house makes noise, of course, but this was different. Every night, as soon as the sun went down, the house would come alive with the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate footsteps that echoed down the hallway, even though Maggie and Tom were the only ones there. Old houses settle, Tom said when Maggie mentioned it. You're just not used to it yet. But Maggie knew something was off. The footsteps didn't sound like settling. They sounded like someone, or something, was walking inside the walls. Sometimes, late at night, she'd lie awake in bed, listening to the slow, shuffling sound, counting the steps as they passed by their bedroom. Weeks went by, and the footsteps became more frequent, more distinct. Then came the whispers. It happened for the first time when Maggie was home alone. She was in the kitchen, making dinner, when she heard it, faint at first, like a low murmur just behind her. She turned, expecting to see Tom, but the room was empty. The house was still. She shook her head, convincing herself it was just the wind or her imagination. But then she heard it again, a soft, indecipherable whisper, as though someone was standing just outside the door, speaking words she couldn't quite catch. Maggie froze, her heart pounding. Tom, she called, even though she knew he wasn't home yet. There was no answer, just the low whispering, growing more persistent, coming from the walls. She grabbed her phone and called Tom, her voice shaking. I think there's someone in the house, she said, barely able to keep her voice steady. I'll be home in 5 minutes, Tom replied, alarmed. Stay put. Don't go anywhere. When he arrived, they searched every inch of the house, but there was nothing. No one had broken in, and nothing was out of place. Maggie tried to explain what she had heard, but Tom just gave her a reassuring smile. It's probably just the house again, he said. We've been under a lot of stress with the move. You're probably just on edge. Maggie wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just her imagination. The whispers were real. Over the next few weeks, the occurrences escalated. Maggie began hearing the whispers at all hours, when she was cooking, cleaning, or even sitting quietly on the porch. The footsteps continued as well, always at night, pacing back and forth, like someone walking endlessly just out of sight. Tom still refused to believe her, chalking it up to her nerves. But Maggie couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, after hours of hearing the same restless footsteps, she grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. She followed the sound down the hallway, her hands trembling as she approached the old linen closet. The footsteps stopped as she opened the door, and she shone the light into the small, cluttered space. At first, there was nothing unusual. But as she pushed aside some old blankets, she noticed something strange. The back wall of the closet didn't seem quite right. The wood was a different color, like it had been replaced. Maggie's heart raced. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough wood, and pushed. To her shock, the panel moved. It swung open with a creak, revealing a hidden passage behind it. Tom, she yelled, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and excitement. Tom came running, and together they peered into the dark passage. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to walk through, and it seemed to stretch deep into the house. What the hell is this? Tom muttered, shining his flashlight into the darkness. I don't know, Maggie whispered. But I think this is where the noises are coming from. Despite their fear, they both felt compelled to explore. They squeezed through the opening and followed the passage, which twisted and turned through the walls of the house. The air was musty, and the floor creaked beneath their feet. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It felt like the walls were closing in on them. After what felt like an eternity, they came to a dead end, a small, windowless room hidden deep within the house. In the center of the room was an old, tattered chair, and next to it, a table with an ancient-looking radio on top. Dust covered everything, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. "What is this place?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible in the heavy silence. Maggie didn't answer. She was staring at something on the wall, scratch marks, hundreds of them, etched deep into the wood. They crisscrossed the walls in every direction, as if someone had spent years trying to claw their way out. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. A low, garbled voice came through, whispering words they couldn't understand. The air grew colder, and the hair on the back of Maggie's neck stood on end. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, grabbing Tom's arm. But before they could move, the footsteps started again. This time, they were louder, faster, and they were coming toward them. Panicked, they turned and ran back through the passage, their hearts pounding in their chests. The footsteps followed, getting closer with every step. It was as if something was chasing them, something they couldn't see but could feel. They burst out of the closet, slamming the panels shut behind them. The house was silent again, but the oppressive feeling lingered, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. That night, they packed their bags and left the house. They didn't bother telling the neighbors or the landlord. They didn't care about the deposit or their belongings. They just wanted to get out. Years later, they would still wake up in the middle of the night, haunted by the memory of that hidden room, the scratch marks, and the footsteps that had followed them. They never spoke of it again, but the fear stayed with them, a dark presence that lurked in the corners of their minds. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside their new home, Maggie could still hear it, the soft, shuffling sound of footsteps, pacing just beyond the walls. Love these stories? YouTube algorithm suggests that you would like to listen to these stories. Click on the video on the screen.